Okay. Well, yes, welcome to the July Prairies call. So I'm just going to start quickly by acknowledging the land that I'm joining from. I'm joining all the way from the East Coast here in Chipuktuk in Mi'kmaq, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. But I ask you, to take a moment in time to reflect upon the land that you are situated on. I know we're joining all across Turtle Island right now, so just take a moment and acknowledge where you're coming from. Take a second to learn a little bit more. If you don't know already, nativeland.com is a really great resource. Here at Climate Reality Project Canada, we honor, recognize, and respect the nations of Turtle Island as the traditional stewards of the land and waters that we are on today, and that we have the pleasure to join you all today here too. And I'm going to pass it over quickly to Michelina, my colleague, to just give a couple of announcements today before we get started.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Michelina. I'm currently joining from Jojage, commonly known as Montreal and Quebec in the Eastern Hemisphere as well, closer to Hope than all of you folks. I just quickly wanted to share a couple of links in the chat. So let me just pull up my notes right here. We have a Saskatchewan lead mentor position open. And so I just wanted to share that here since, a lot of you are located in the prairies. And so if you know of any CRLs that are located in Saskatchewan, that position is open. We also are celebrating our 15th birthday this year as an organization. And to do so, we are opening nominations for everyone in our community to participate, as we want to highlight the work that you do and the great work that you do on the ground and celebrate everything. And so to do that, we have nominations open. You can nominate yourself, you can nominate somebody else. And yeah, I don't want to take up too much time on this, but I'll send all links in the chat. And then one other thing, we're planning a Prairies training that'll likely take place in the winter 2024. And we were just wanted to see if you had any insights on what you want to see out of this training in regards to themes. So we prepared a quick survey, and if you could just take the time to fill that out, if you have the time, it probably takes about 5 minutes or less of your time. So I'm going to send those all in the chat. And yeah, those are really all of my updates. And also we have a new lead mentor in Manitoba, Adam Johnson, who's joining us. So he just joined the team in June. And so we're really happy that this is his first Prairies call with all of you. So yeah. And with that, I will introduce our panel today. So we have Sarah Delano, who's a mother and language instructor. She is a member of the Métis Nations of Alberta and has ancestral ties to River Lot 28, one lot over from where Kinnard Rat Creek Ravine sits and very close to where she currently lives in the community of Parkdale, Edmonton. She harvests plants and berries in the ravine with her daughter and her students and has recently completed a community-based research project and recipe book on diversity in green space and urban agriculture. As part of her study, she also completed a report on Métis urban plant use for the Métis Nation of Alberta, with the goals of increasing the safety of urban harvesting for MNA citizens, as well as advocating for city policy that is more responsive to Métis plant harvesting rights. Sarah holds degrees in cultural studies and community engagement and currently teaches at the University of Alberta, McEwen University, and Multicultural Family Resource Society. Then we have Jeanette Civile, apologies if I pronounced it wrong, is a sustainability planner in the city of Winnipeg and the coordinator of the Winnipeg Food Council, Citizen Advisory Committee of the Winnipeg City Council. Previously, she was an urban farmer in Winnipeg and a community organizer with the provincial network of small-scale farmers and local food advocates. She holds an MA in geography from the University of Manitoba, where her studies focus on food sovereignty and the local food movement. In 2020, she won a CBC Manitoba Future 40 Award for her work in sustainable food systems. And she's also currently a board co-chair of Firewood Food Co-op, originally from southeastern Manitoba. She resides in Winnipeg with her family. And then we have Adrienne Werner, who's been involved in grassroots environmental conservation and food systems work for over a decade. As an avid volunteer, he understands the value of local leaders who make a difference in their communities. Adrian is an author, an avid birder, and a skilled gardener. He uses his knowledge to engage with people about the climate crisis and actions we can take. He holds a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Winnipeg and a master's certificate in project management from the University of Saskatchewan, and just received a master's degree in leadership from the University of Guelph. He lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And with that, I'll hand it back over to, I believe, Hope to facilitate.
Thank you so much, Michelina. I'm so excited to hear from all of our panelists today. So we've got a couple questions that we're gonna go over, and feel free to take turns responding to one another. This is very loose in terms of format, so if you want to interrupt one another, that's totally fine. It's makes the situation more lively. So our first question is, just imagine and situate yourself and your many roles within the food system. How would you describe the food system based on your experiences? So really, what is the food system based on your experiences?
Is there one of us who wants to have start? I know now that I've said something, you'll probably look at me. Yes, okay, super. I think it also helps to add a little bit to that introduction of myself. So I ran an urban farm in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan for the Saskatoon Food Bank and Learning Center, and ran workplace experience programs through that. And so, and I sat on the Saskatoon Food Council board for a number of years. So that's sort of part of that too. And I think, how would I describe, I think where I situate myself in the food system, I think an eater is a really important part. I think we shared a meal together here a little bit earlier, although mine was a bit scarfed down between audio fixing stuff. But I think at least what got me into food systems was through simply being an eater, and then realizing that the way that we get our food is incredibly complicated, but also the way that people access it, and it's the security of the system, and who produces the food is also incredibly complex. So I think that it's not particularly profound, but I would describe the food system as really messy and really challenging, and it's really hard to picture as a system. And I guess that's one of the challenges of complex systems. So I'll keep it fairly brief, but that's my quick summary of how I see the food system. Do you want to go, Sarah? Since we're side by side.
Yeah, since I'm sitting right here, so I'm having trouble figuring out where I should look. I'll look at the screen, I guess. So yeah, I think the food system certainly is messy. Describing a food system is like describing, a political system. We could go anywhere with that. But for me, food systems connect me to community in a lot of ways. And so my identity within the food system would be, and that's why I put it in my bio, being a mom, which means I'm feeding somebody and also teaching somebody. And I am a teacher as well. So I often connect I kind of connect communication and community to food in a lot of ways. Food and culture, food and gathering, that kind of thing. And I'm definitely a student as well, a student of all things food. I'm a terrible cook. I was telling everyone, even though I have recently done this recipe book project. I do some food programming at my community league. So again, that kind of community connection. I have connections to rural and urban spaces through food, which is an important part of my identity as well. I grew up in an urban space, and now I live in a very, I grew up in a rural space, and I live in a very urban space now. And I also connect to the food system as a Métis person, as an Indigenous person, and that brings with it a lot of other things as well, including wild foods. So I think sometimes wild foods are left out of discussions on food systems, and that's something that I'm really interested in. That's it for me.
Thanks both. Yeah, I guess situating myself in the food system, I kind of came like to food systems work almost accidentally. I was looking at a practicum placement in my undergrad, just like wanting to kind of graduate. And I ended up being paired up with, I did an undergrad in international development studies. And so most of my peers were going overseas or something international. And I was looking for something where I could stay a bit closer to home and I could still kind of do like the community building work that I needed to do for my practicum. And I ended up being paired with a bunch of intrepid folks who were starting up an urban farm in Winnipeg. And they knew what they were doing. And they kind of took me along for the ride. And we started the Metanoia Farmers Worker Cooperative at a university here in Winnipeg. And it ended up being a place where I did a lot of kind of transformative learning and a lot of kind of adult learning over the years. I ended up I finished my practicum and then I came back and I, would do like directed readings courses around the farm and was able to kind of weave it into a lot of my my academic work. And then through the urban farm, I actually started to get to know what other small scale producers across the province were facing. And sort of out of like a situation that happened, I started urban farming in 2011. In 2013, there was a situation in the small scale farming community here in Manitoba where a local producer had won, it was a local producer processor, I suppose. They had won an award for best cured meat product. And then later that same year, they were shut down by the Department of Agriculture for having food that was unsafe to eat when the same department had just given them an award like 6 months previous. And the local food community got really upset about the consistency the consistently inconsistent regulations that they were finding in the local food space in the province. And so I became involved as a community organizer shortly after that event took place. And I got to know a lot of different producers across the province. I did some community-based research work with some academics through that and eventually rolled it into my master's degree where I looked at food sovereignty and the local food movement in Manitoba. And then just before I graduated, I started working with the Winnipeg Food Council, which was it was kind of like this urban CSA urban farm experience to this kind of like rural network of like, and I come from outside, I come from southeast, outside of Winnipeg, southeast Manitoba. So that was a context that I was really familiar with. And then working with the Winnipeg Food Council, I was back in an urban space, not just looking at food production, but also looking at like all different parts of the food system because it was very much a food systems lens that was being applied. So looking at issues of food insecurity, which is a really significant problem in Winnipeg, and right through to like food waste and what was going on kind of right throughout the whole food system, and trying to put that together and trying to see how this works all together. And that's I think that's still a pretty like different and unique space for a lot of people in the food world. So it's kind of been it's felt like it's definitely been more from a food producer kind of side, and obviously that's really been kind of the community organizing around policy and issues facing kind of small scale direct market type producers in Winnipeg and the barriers to getting that food to market. So how would I describe the food system based on my experiences? Maybe I'll touch a little bit more on that in our next question, perhaps.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm reminded listening to all of you how we have a really nice array of experiences on this panel. So Adrian didn't specify, but just because I know him, I know that a lot of his food work was actually based in Saskatoon. And so we have actually all three prairie provinces represented in terms of like experiences with the food system. You all have really great experiences when it comes to the production side of things, but also the consumption and being able to watch that linear progression go through. And I think a lot of people are generally just consumers and they don't necessarily think about all of the larger things. And so I think that's where this question came from of, well, what does the larger system mean? Yeah, and I think, we're all here, the Climate Reality Project focuses on climate change, and I think more and more we all are realizing that climate change and food systems are inextricably connected. And so this next question really addresses that. So where do you see climate change intersecting with food systems, especially the food systems that you might have just described or talked about?
Oh, who should go?
I think we should go around the same way we did before, Adrian.
All right, darn it all right, perfect. All right, so I think I'm going to really focus for a moment on my experience working at the food bank, and that is really, I'm going to try to sort of narrow in on the sort of sometimes food banks end up being the dumping ground of the food system, the sort of place of last resort before food goes to waste. And so I think in that way, there's this intersection of vulnerability and waste and all of these pieces. So I think for me, what struck me so much was how much waste is produced in the food system and how that impacts and depending on the city, whether that goes to landfill. So that I'm seeing that increasingly, that food banks are pitching themselves as climate initiatives to actually get more funding, and which is really interesting because that means that the key sort of mandate, center core of what you imagine of a food bank actually becomes a byproduct of reducing waste. And I'm not completely sure I agree with that as a direction, whether that perhaps we should be centering the humans in the food system more than the fossil fuel reduction, but certainly it's an interesting change in the way people are marketing food rescue and pieces like this. And that's a very complicated system, quite ad hoc. I mean, I think most of us know of gleaners or videos of people who've gone, who are dumpster diving for food. And so that's a specific kind of privilege or vulnerability, depending on who is interacting with that and how that's criminalized. So there are areas of the city where there are, grocery stores will leave out food for dumpster divers, and there are areas where they'll lock their bins. In a similar way, there are food organizations who are sort of deemed appropriate receivers of rescued food. So the waste in the food system. And there are organizations and people who are deemed inappropriate receivers of that food. And so I think in the food bank, I spent a lot of my time navigating where the food that we weren't eating was going. Knowing that there's sort of this triage between, in an ideal world, safe food goes to humans first, and then food goes to animals, and then to composting, and then to energy, and then finally to the landfill. So that's sort of classic waste diversion triangle. But what I think was really interesting was that we were seeing that in the number, when it actually comes down to how that is negotiated, it's far more fraught, because in some ways it's easier to have one person to give that food to. And so in the way that climate is interacting with food security at the food bank level, can cause really interesting dynamics which aren't necessary, but can sometimes pit good, well-meaning initiatives in food rescue against the capacity of food banks. A good example is when the organics ban in Vancouver was put in place. The local food bank was essentially being given non-food grade food because nothing, when there was an organics ban in the landfill, suddenly that food needed to go somewhere to save money. And so it was dumped on a lot of food banks. And so when I was in Saskatoon and on the Food Council, I got to work at this from two different perspectives. So it was, we do need an organics ban to stop methane emissions in the landfill, but we need to do it in a way that protects food banks from becoming a dumping ground of non-food grade food. So that's only a tiny piece. I feel like Sarah and Jeanette, you can talk about different pieces of that, but that's something that really struck me in the way that reacting to climate change is changing the space of food systems where I sat in the system. Sarah, on to you.
Great, yeah, and actually.
Oh, you muted both of yourselves, I think. Oh, hold on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just muted a second by accident.
I know I keep trying to touch this.
So automatic.
So like a couple of things that you mentioned, one kind of people being the heart of the food system and how sometimes, you know, measuring between climate and people becomes a thing, which is not, you know, something that we probably want to avoid. And then the other thing that you mentioned is just being, you know, noting these different perspectives and how that, you know, changes maybe the way that you think about both climate change and food systems and how they interact together. And so I think from my experience, I had sort of two major interactions with climate change and food systems. And the first one was some of the work that I was doing with the Métis Nation of Alberta here in Edmonton. And that was around, I was doing an internship with sustainability scholars with them. And we were looking at Métis perspectives on sustainability, and it was really centered around food and gathering berries and things like that, specifically in urban settings. Because I think something like 70% of Métis people now live in urban settings, as do most people in the world. And so what we were coming up with a lot of times was like almost a pushback to these types of relational understandings of sustainability and relational understandings of land, and how that, you know, from one perspective really connects us to food, to land, and makes us want to steward that in a really real way. And sometimes that was coming up against these ideas of protecting urban green space, protecting the river valley here in Edmonton, which again, and as you mentioned, are very, you know, well-meaning people wanting to protect those spaces, but those two different perspectives coming up in terms of, you know, how do you, first of all, how do you understand kind of environmentalism, and where are these ideas of environmentalism coming from, and are they taking into account different people's perspectives on how we relate to land and how we protect land and see land. And so I think for me, food really bridges that very well, right? Because the way that we want to protect the things that we eat and the spaces that we eat in and gather in, I think really link food to climate resiliency. So that was one of the interesting projects. And then the second one was kind of an offshoot of that. And it was a community research project that was looking at both Métis perspectives, which was myself, and then 10 women that I was working with who were all from different countries, and how they interacted with local space. And so local food and local climate movements and diversity is another area that I'm really interested in, because again, we get these different perspectives coming up. And I think that when we can connect climate to food, it has such a personal connection to each one of us. And it also connects us to space in a very interesting way. Excuse me, connect us to local space when we're gathering food, when we're growing food, but we always have these food memories and these food recipes and experiences and family connections that I think really create a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose within a space that moves forward these kind of day-to-day climate change actions, I think community actions and things that we can really do like on a daily basis. So for me, that's kind of how the two connect.
Yeah, I think you both shared really interesting things that I feel like I've been in the food world long enough to remember, like Adrienne was talking about, like food being, you know, like food diversion and you know, how do we think about that, you know, waste hierarchy. And I feel like I've been around long enough to remember when it seemed really like a shady practice to be sending food to charitable organizations instead of, you know, as if like it was, you know, second-rate food that that now we were just gonna kind of hand off to, you know, people in don't they deserve the dignity of having, you know, not second-rate food kind of things. And I think there's been like some learning for me too on how sometimes excess is built into business structures and it isn't necessarily second rate, but that's a fun, like that's a whole other conversation we have, right? And so I think that's really interesting. For me, it really when I think about climate and food systems, certainly like that, I think you both kind of touched upon, you know, centering people in food systems and how does that, what happens when we start, if we center climate in food systems, or center people in food systems, are those two different discussions. And I'm right away thinking of like another whole thesis that somebody could write. But I think that it's really like, for me, it comes down to the food production. It comes down to the vulnerabilities that our food system faces in the face of shocks, right? We saw that during the pandemic. We saw how quickly things can change. We, definitely saw the kind of the fear and the apprehension people had when they couldn't find the things they were used to finding in grocery stores, and wondering about how much food supply do we really have if things are disrupted. And I think that this kind of just in time kind of food system, some people say, well, it's actually quite nimble because you've got, you can replace one thing with another really quickly, but it didn't really seem like, it doesn't really seem like it has the resiliency and the, the kind of even the redundancy built in to be able to withstand some of these shocks, and whether we're seeing those through things we can't find in grocery stores or food prices that are increasing as a result of climate change. There definitely are, we saw it with the pandemic. We've seen it with kind of geopolitical events where all of a sudden, trade is, there's a trade barrier that's put up and we can't, market something. And so food prices increase. And so what are we doing to increase the resiliency as we start to see more impacts of climate change throughout the world in places that are traditionally considered the breadbaskets of the world? What are we doing to increase resiliency in our food system at home? Not just thinking about, farmers markets where food is hard for most people to access. But what are we thinking, like, how are we thinking about like regional food systems and actually fostering food system, like everything that a regional food system needs, the supply chain, the markets, the producers, the processing, the infrastructure, all of that. And like, where is the policy to support that? For sure, in Manitoba, that's an issue. We have the very small and we have the very big. We're a province that, similar to Saskatchewan and Alberta, is well known for agriculture, but we're not very good at feeding ourselves. So what's happening with the table foods? What's happening with the food for people, as opposed to food for commodities and for export markets? And I think that's intrinsically linked to climate change, and an issue that we're going to see becoming more and more important as we continue to feel the impacts of climate change. So I think that is that's really important. Like our food system has a hard time feeding people already. We have so much food insecurity. We have so many people accessing food banks, way more than we ever had before the pandemic. I think in Winnipeg it's doubled. It's new people going to food banks. It's people who never thought that they would have to access a food bank. So food is already inaccessible. So yeah, how can we? It's all one big kind of food systems related issue, I think, and definitely need to work on that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, can I add one point?
Yeah, we have a pointer question. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay, so
If you just say your name, we should be able to hear you on that mic.
Oh,
Yeah, you don't need to unmute.
okay. Okay, yeah, you can see me. My name is Hira Muktan. I'm kind of like new, first time here in this gathering. I'm not a good speaker, but try to understand me what I'm trying to say about the food system. Just very good points you already have, like told, like Adrian, Sarah, and Janet, right? You guys said. I have just a couple of points with the food system. It's gonna be going here. It's too much, two songs, right? Okay. What I feel like a food system, like I'm just trying to put like a different perspective that what you guys like. You guys are all food experts, so I'm not the food expert, so I've just really thought on that. So the questions came like how we relate with the climate real change and then the food systems, right? So there's very good points. So the foods actually the food is the center point for every community, right? Without food, like if there's no food, people start moving here and there. Where is the food? People go there, right? I came here in Alberta because I found the food here. Sure, because job, right? So that's my food, right? So that's why I'm here. If I found better food other places, I go there, right? So that the food is the most central point, right? And the food we're talking about is in my there's two kinds of food that's we're talking about every day we eat the food, right? And there's a food chain in science, like a food chain it's kind of like a transfer of energy from a producer to the consumer, right? So the producer means like a plant, and then we're the consumers. All the living beings are consumers. So the plant produces the foods. We are not producer actually. But in business world, we see like we are the producer. Farmers are the producer. They produce the food, and we are the consumer. We never produce. We just buy and consume that food, right? So there is two different way to look at the consumer and the producers, right? In science, they look different way, but as in business, like in the world, they look different way, right? So that's what here and then the other parts like I'm just don't want to try to make a full on. So I just want to make like here what is the impact of the climate change with the food system, right? So what strikes me here, it's very visible, right? The climate change is very visible where it's happening now. We're feeling now, right now, not before, like right. That we're feeling, we can see the climate change every day, right, in our life also. So if you see it in Alberta, in Alberta also, the food system are changing, right? The way we're taking food production food production, right? So, everything is changing because the food systems is always impacted by our climate change. So what are those factors, right? So we have to understand that part first, too much rain, increase of temperature, right? Like a change in the temperature, I would say, right? And then our climate system is like a drought, rain, right? So in Alberta, sometimes farmer asks the government for compensations if there's too much rain. They cannot get their food, right, harvested right into right, they can't get from the field, right? So we lost the food there in the field. They can't get out from there. That time there is a lot of either too much rain or a snow comes and then burn all the foods, right? So that's also right. So too early a snow, too much rain, right? And sometimes in Alberta, one of the place there is a lot of drought if you see in the southern parts where a lot of foods are comes from there, right? We have an irrigation system in place, right? Even though sometimes when the drought goes, river get dried, can't irrigate our food, right? So we can't get the food from there. So the food production is completely down there, right? So right now today I was reading the CBC news. So there is one restaurants like in Edmonton right now, they are producing their hot chili homemade right now because there is no coming out from we're not importing any kind of the hot chili from that is from Japan, Thailand, whatever they used to send the hot chili, we're not getting. So since 2 months, there is a restaurant called Parmanadi, is vegetarian restaurants. They are making their own the hot sauce because they're not getting the red chili, right? So they whatever the production over here in the Alberta or BC, they get that chili and they dry them and they make the paste out of that, right? So these are the kind of the factors that is really connected with our food system. So that anything happen in the climates that directly impacts the food systems, right? And then and then other things we have this is Canada is a lot of indigenous home of the indigenous people, right? So they're all depends on the natural things, right? So what about the plants, rivers, like a fish, right? Any foods from they directly get from the lands, right? So what happening right now? So we're going back to our back to our climate, like what I'm saying, like 1,000 years back, right? So 1,000 years before, like the Alberta was very warm temperature in Alberta, right? It's warm, there's no snow, there's a lot of temperate, the plants are different, tropical plants are here, used to be here, right? So now the temperature is changing, the temperature is rising, so we are going to back to that kind of getting that kind of plants. So these plants might gonna be one day vanish, right? So it will be gone, right? So that will directly impact our food system also, right? So these are the things that I just wanted to say. That's all I think, this is directly related to the climate and the food systems. And then we have the food waste and then those things these are the vulnerability of the foods, right? So those comes later, right?
Yeah.
First, we have to have a productions first, right? So you have productions to feed the peoples, and then comes the money to buy. Can you afford to buy those foods or not, right? So if you cannot buy, then we have to go to the food bank, right? And then the food banks comes later, right? That's all I have to say. Sorry about that. Yeah.
No, thank
Yeah,
you
no,
so much.
I was just gonna respond to that if I could. Yeah, you make really great points about the impacts of climate change on primary agriculture, and how also I think it's interesting to talk about also the role that agriculture plays in greenhouse gas emissions, also from kind of that perspective. In Manitoba, it's like 30, I can't remember the exact number, but about 30% of our GHG emissions come from agriculture. The Global Alliance for the Future of Food estimates that about, sometimes I remember numbers very badly, so I'm not actually going to say, but there's a huge percentage of emissions that come from not just agriculture, but also our food system. I maybe have it written down somewhere in front of me. No, I don't. Yeah, so it's not just primary agriculture, but it's the food system as a whole. And so that's a really it's a really significant amount. And I know in Manitoba, one of the I think our single primary, our main our largest single point emitter is a fertilizer plant that's located just outside of Brandon. So those agricultural inputs that go into our primary agriculture contribute a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions also. So there's definitely there's work to do on both sides, right? The contributions of agriculture to climate change, the ways that agriculture is changing because of climate change. I think you talked about crop insurance, also how that's so important. And our growing season is changing. I think you talked about plants that are found in different places. We're anticipating having a longer growing season across the prairies as we continue to feel the impacts of climate change, which could arguably be good for agriculture production in the prairies. So there's, I think, thanks for bringing up those points. I think they're really important to consider too when we're thinking about climate and the food system.
Thank you so much. Sarah and Adrian, did you want to say anything, or happy to move on as well?
I was just gonna say, yeah, it was really a bunch of interesting points, and it's something that I think about too when I think about the kind of the community connections to food, and especially in urban spaces, because when I talk to my parents who still live in rural Alberta, they're always talking about, there was this terrible drought, or there was, and everybody is affected because it's a farming community, and it's huge. The impact is huge. And sometimes we're not super connected to those types of sort of crises that are happening because we're in urban centers. And I find that those food connections that we can build within urban centers, like you're saying, growing chilies, for example, when people are connected in that way to food in urban spaces, I think that it helps to it helps to illustrate kind of what's happening on a global scale in a really local way. So when like the work that we do a lot of berry picking, we go into the river valley, and when you're doing that seasonally, you notice right away, like just like what you're saying, you know, you notice what the impacts are because you know from previous seasons what should be happening. And we were doing jam making this year, and I had to actually pick, we do flower jam and berry jam from like urban gathering. And I had to actually pick some of the flowers and put them in my fridge for the first time ever, because the date that we make the jam as a community group, they were going to be all gone. Because you notice like it's a huge change. The berries too, there was a lady here earlier who said she was going to take her little sister to pick Saskatoons. And I'm noticing too, the Saskatoons are much earlier than they ever were before. And I think a lot of that connection to plants that grow, and not necessarily that they have to be fully native plants to the area, because of course we have all kinds of introduced species that have been here forever and ever, and people eat them and they're great plants. But those connections to foods that grow wild, we notice immediately those changes. We notice it with cucumbers in the backyard and things like that as well, but those connections to the local plants, you start to, it makes that impact, I think, much more strong in individual people's minds when they're seeing those changes. So I'm really happy that you brought that up.
Yeah, and that actually really resonated with me too. What you were saying about Saskatoon. So this year in Winnipeg, we had a 1 week Saskatoon season. And it was like one of these things where I happened to be in Quebec that week. And so I missed Saskatoons completely as far as like commercial picking. I was, you know, a neighbor had a bush in their back lane that I was able to harvest from. But other than that, like I missed it entirely. And similarly along Saskatoon's, like I used to volunteer with an organization called Wild About Saskatoon, that ran a festival of urban nature, and the festival was timed to start when the Saskatoons bloomed. That was the date set for the start of the festival. And so it was very bizarre to realize that we had to change the festival, or like by the end of the 10-year period that it was run, it didn't line up very well with when the Saskatoons bloomed. And I think rural folks often get a bad reputation, or can, in the climate space. And I think one of the interesting things about being that connected to the land and to the space is that in many ways, I think the experience of climate change is more real. It's just the way that that's processed isn't necessarily the same as you do in an urban area. And similarly, like with gardeners, like you talk to a gardener about the weather, and I think regardless of where they sit on ideologically, there's a very real feeling that something is different. And I think that's actually a really powerful opportunity for communication and for having really honest, relatable conversations. That was often the in route for me when I was talking climate change in my work, was being in the garden and just saying, well, look at this, like, oh, you know, this cucumbers are ready this week, and then just those very grounded in space and in place and in time as a jumping point for more meaningful connection over a very huge and abstract and worrying thing. And so I think that was a very important part too, is that very real, tangible connection.
I like they said grounded too, with a good gardening plan.
They're built
Number one,
yeah.
that's number one tonight.
Watch out, don't challenge me.
Counter is nail on.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. Thanks so much, everyone. This is really great. Yeah, I'm happy to move on to this last question. And you all are already touching on this naturally, but what do you see as ways to unpack food systems towards environmental and social justice within cities?
So I think it's very unfortunate that the food system does not pay people what they really a survivable amount of money at almost any point in the system. Farmers of any scales struggle to make it economically. I mean, the off-farm job, which almost any small to medium farm that I know, you know, one person's on the farm or the family are pitching together on the farm, but almost everyone has off-farm jobs to finance that work. And so I see that as a product of a system that doesn't serve farmers. I was very lucky to work for a nonprofit organization that ran a farm from grants, but when you're actually truly trying to make a financial go at it, it's incredibly challenging and the margins are so tight. And then similarly, if you look at like large scale operations, the folks who are picking and growing food like are not being paid anything, even to Canadian, like below minimum wages, and the working conditions are not always fantastic either. And so like our entire system is built to make our food affordable because no one in the food system is being paid enough, but also the consumer isn't earning enough to pay for that. And so there's this huge challenge in the system. Food workers, food processors, like you could pretty much name almost anyone in that food system, grocery clerks, and you don't see anyone living a wage that's actually surviving. And so as far as like what I see as a massive challenge to the sustainability of our food system and the ability to have like a just system is the fact that throughout the entire system, no one is benefiting, or like no one's earning what they're really worth, if that's fair. I'm trying to think of the right words to say, but it's like, and that harms us as consumers. It harms us as climate engaged folks, because I don't think it gives folks the dignity necessary to earn meaningful wages and engage meaningfully in a healthy and productive food system that protects our planet. And I think that plays out in many different ways, but I personally see that as a fundamental challenge. And so to actually work for that is to think about what it means to support people along that entire system. For some, it's sort of simple to go more direct, but that's simply not possible for folks living on fixed incomes, many of whom can be working in the food industry. And so thinking about other ways to support the livability of these systems, I think is really crucial. I know that's not a tangible answer, but I think it's a really important thing. There are obviously some policies, the minimum living wage, these pieces that benefit a lot of folks, which could support how we build a system. And I think I'm going to leave it at that.
So I'll go a little bit more tangible then.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know.
No, I think so. Yeah, I mean, because system change is probably the best, right? But in terms of things that can happen, you know, in the short term, I think about this quite a bit with the groups that I work with, and I think there's kind of two things that I note that might be, you know, sort of tangible action related or adjacent. One would be access to local food that's a little more equitable. So some of the things that I think both of you already mentioned some of these things, especially with the food bank work. But I really like the connection between urban gardens, community gardens, and food banks. I think it's a no-brainer and it's great, right? Getting fresh food into the food bank is such a key thing. I work for there's kind of two organizations here in Edmonton. One is called Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op, and the sister organization is Multicultural Family Resource Society. And I work for that one. But the sister organization does something called Grocery Run, which is like especially over COVID, it was a delivery of a fresh kind of basket to people who were lower income. And that was a really great program because it also had the option for people to get into the garden and do some of the growing if they wanted to. And I think that's a really great way to access local food because it's empowering. It creates that sense of belonging. And again, there wasn't, you know, a need to get into the garden because there were also a lot of single parent families and people that might not necessarily have time to be growing food, unfortunately. And then I think there can be sort of access to local food through education about local food. And the second point is kind of around engagement. in food systems. So related maybe to the education, but I think sometimes the engagement in both the food systems circles and also the environmental movement circles are not as broad as they could be. So including some of those voices that we don't always hear, or moving beyond the usual suspects of kind of the people involved in those movements. And I think that can be done in a lot of ways, more creative engagement. I was recently reading about Vancouver doing story nights to talk when they were working on their food strategy and food policy, where they just had people come in and tell stories. And some of them were even drawing, like doing storyboards, because different people were speaking different languages but really interesting engagement. I think since Hope, you're in Halifax, I heard that Halifax sent home meal kits for people to get together with their neighbors and do meals and talk about what they feel are issues within the food systems or within their own production and consumption of food. I thought that was really cool. And so I think there's a lot of things that can be done around engagement, making sure that we're kind of catching all of those other perspectives of what's happening in the food system. And also thinking about, what are our ultra hyper local foods that are wild foods? Because in Canada, and I think there are a lot of reasons for this, and I maybe won't go into that now, but we do tend to overlook our wild foods. And there are a lot of foods that we can access for free. And all of my students that come out berry picking with me are always really floored by how much free food we have access to right here. Even in the inner city in Edmonton, we have access to the River Valley, and we're able to access a lot of really great fruit. And so I think there's an education piece there as well, that not only connects us to nutrition and food, but it connects us to that kind of sense of belonging. It connects us to our history and to our land, and lots of good things. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Yeah. I think, Adrienne and Sarah have put forward so many great ideas. I'm probably going to repeat a bunch of kind of the ideas and themes and maybe verbatim what was been said. But I think that, like this situation where we have producers who themselves are so often making poverty wages, and consumers who have a hard time accessing food because they also make poverty wages, I think is like, it just like blows my mind sometimes. Somebody said in the chat about reframing our economy towards the people that we need in our economy, like people who produce food, I think, and just the ability to access food. It's like I'm amazed at how many either food-based kind of community-based food-related community-based organizations and small-scale producers in Manitoba who understand this issue, that they are a lot of farmers that I know understand that people can't access their food, and so they're trying to address it through sliding scale CSA shares, through pay what you can kind of models. Prairies Food Co-op has a veggie van where they get local produce and they have it subsidized, and then they drive it around to different community-based organizations in food desert areas of the city and sell it at like up to 70% reduced cost to people, and sometimes 100% reduced cost. So like there are programs that are starting to work at these issues, but it's such a large problem that we really do need the policy to come and just like really, like, I mean, what Adrienne and Sarah both said, transform that system and really change it and turn it on its head into something that makes sense for people and makes sense for our changing climate. I think in Manitoba, that looks like developing that missing middle, scaling up the infrastructure, the abattoirs, the packing plants, that sort of thing, to really create a system that can work at scale. It's really interesting to hear stories from the Toronto, the Ontario Food Terminal just outside Toronto, and how that mechanism has actually helped to kind of keep even food prices in check when it comes to the prices of produce in Ontario. So something that's at that scale that can actually make that that kind of tangible difference. I think we have a lot of farmers who are aging out of food production, so reducing barriers to new entrants, getting just like communities, getting more people on the land, I think is really key. We've seen a lot of people move to cities in the last 70 years. We don't have as many people interacting with their landscapes or producing food. So I think policies that can support people wanting to live outside of cities. So rural healthcare, rural childcare, those kinds of things that people need. I think that there's a lot. Adrian talked about guaranteed basic income or livable income. That's huge for people being able to afford food. Some of the policies that the Winnipeg Food Council has put forward focus on looking at how the city of Winnipeg is the largest market for regional foods in Manitoba. And because of the way that food production is regulated in the provinces, local food production often is sold within the province or just kind of within like a couple kilometers of the border. And so really like looking at what the markets are within the province. So Winnipeg is the largest market, despite lots of the province being closer to other, major markets maybe. And so what can the city do to support more markets, to make it a favorable activity that's supported through different, municipal channels? I think that's really important. Obviously, the city has things that they can do about food waste. Adrian, you scared me a little bit when you talked about the impacts of an organics ban, because Winnipeg's just considering that right now. Well, not an organics ban. We're not talking about an organics ban. They're talking about a residential food waste collection project. Different. It's not an organics ban. And so, so there's a lot of, I think, those kinds of actions that can be taken to make our food system more sustainable and also more just, because food's really inaccessible now as it is, and climate thoughtful food is also inaccessible. So so I think we've just got like an issue to tackle kind of across the food system when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Do you mind if I quickly jump in as an eater? I think all of these conversations really reminded me of one other piece that's another really tangible action. And I think is like learn how to eat resiliently, if that makes sense. And so we know that the food system is volatile and that climate change puts us at risk of more volatility. And I think one of the things that I learned running cooking classes at the food bank and running an urban farm is that we have a lot to learn on how to eat in a resilient way from folks who are experiencing food insecurity, because they have to make a challenging food situation work for them as much as possible. And so I think I, in many ways, learned way more from them on how to stretch the food that I have way further than I would have ever been able to do if I was an eater without those experiences. And so I think one of the things that I certainly learned in my experience was that I think it's very easy as a society to put a lot of our expectations onto folks living in poverty and expect that we can be the teachers. And specifically in this way, there's a lot that we can be taught. And I think that our society can certainly benefit from that, from an adaptation and resilience perspective, as well as simply a joy that there's obviously an incredible amount of struggle from a food insecure household, but I think you can't completely ignore the ways to find joy in food, no matter where you are in the food system and what your specific experiences are in that system. And I think that's a type of adaptation and resilience that I certainly hope we as a society don't need to learn, but I think that we have a lot to learn from folks who are facing shocks currently, if that makes sense. So that's another very tangible action that doesn't require a lot of complexity, but it's just like learn how, like practice eating resiliently as well as locally.
That's a really good point. And I think that like that's like as yeah, we want to talk about like tangible things that like we can all take away from tonight. Like what your next meal is a really tangible thing to think about. And like some of that is like basic, you know, cooking skills that that are being lost, and the time to cook also, right? That's another big challenge. I know that for myself as a person who works full time, has a 5-year-old, it's really hard. And like just, and then yeah, thinking about what you're eating and the climate footprint of the foods that you're using is really tangible. Also, you know, reducing kind of conventional red meat is one really easy way to do it too. So I think that's yeah, that's a really good point, Adrienne, and something that's very tangible. Mm-hmm.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, absolutely. We have
So I'm Shantu. You were talking about feeding your child, we were talking about it. So when my son was very, very little, I had a rule in the house that if you could read, you could cook. So as soon as he could read, I gave him all the books and said, here you go, pick what you like. But he's a vegetarian. So he basically came back to me and said, well, I need a balanced meal. So what does that mean? So we started talking about that a lot. So it was interesting. But the challenge then was going into our fridge and opening the door and not finding those ingredients. So then, you know, learning to be really creative and coming up with meals that made sense and had all the colors of the rainbow that my son needed and he said he needed. So it was a real challenge to look at food that way. And then relating that back to a farm that we know, a research farm we know, where people grew food and we would go and harvest in the fall, and half of the food you can take away and the other half went into the food bank. So my son was part of that piece and trying to understand how many carrots do we collect at one point. That 3,000 pounds of carrots at one point, and then, you know, figuring out how to package it and talk about it and what does that mean to get it out into the community. So really interesting conversations about food and how it relates to ourselves. Of course, I'm a carnivore, by the way, and I had a vegetarian son. So it was really interesting for me to try and manage that whole conversation and process. So this has been very enlightening for me to listen to all of the other stories that's happening, you know, across Canada. So thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're totally open to any other questions or comments from the audience. Now we've gone through most of our questions and there's been some really, really great discussions. So feel free to take an idea from any of the stuff that has been discussed or talked about already and share your own experiences, ask a question to this wonderful panel of people.
I did find my stat from before. It's 30% of global emissions from our food system.
Oh, wow.
3% of climate financing that goes towards it. I find it really like interesting and exciting to see how the kind of the climate space has really started to talk more about food in the last I don't know how many years it's been, but yeah, like I've been doing food stuff for a long time, and then started working in climate mitigation, adaptation, strategy building for the city just a few years ago too, at the same time. And so to see that lens focusing on our food system has been really really great to see that conversation start up.
Amazing. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, great conversation. You know, I'm learning a lot, and it's you know, a critical, important topic. So thanks for having it. You know, I was just thinking about there was some video that I watched a couple of years ago where somebody had the idea was it was an app where, you know, if you were, say there was a corporate event that had a whole bunch of food left over, you take a picture of it and you send it out, and then people can come and get that food. And I know there's a whole bunch of regulations and stuff that probably stand in the way of that, but is there any hope of some kind of, or is anybody, you know, hearing anything about something like that? So that I know that corporate Canada throws out a lot of good food, that you know, with all of these parties that they have, and you know, they might not want to just throw that out, and it'd be nice if we could divert some of that stuff. So is any, I guess, what are the perils, and you know, what are the opportunities there?
In Manitoba, I know, and I think Jennifer mentioned it in the chat, or alluded to it a little bit in the chat earlier, we have legislation that protects charitable food giving. It protects the donator from any kind of, I guess, health and safety or kind of liability concerns with donating food. We have a few organizations that are active in Winnipeg and Manitoba, that some which might be active in other provinces as well. They primarily focus on ingredients, not necessarily prepared foods. I'm not sure if they do anything prepared food related, to be honest, but Leftovers Foundation is one. I think they're actually active in Calgary, Edmonton, and Winnipeg, as I think there are 3 cities specifically. And then Second Harvest is another one that is across Canada, has recently been active in the Prairies as well. And they both have apps, and they have kind of a little bit different ways of operating. And so depending on the organization, you might find one or the other more helpful. But I feel like prepared foods, I feel like, I don't know, Food Not Bombs do some of that type of stuff. I'm not 100% sure. I feel like there have been some smaller organizations that have done that sort of thing in the past, where they would like take it and freeze it or whatever, and then distribute it from there. But I'm not aware of anything that's active presently in Manitoba that does prepared foods. From I'm familiar with organizations that will like take ingredients and they'll make them into prepared foods and divert them that way. But yeah.
Sorry. I think there is an organization here in Edmonton, a social enterprise that offers seniors who live in their homes and have left, you know, a growing space, and they would go in and grow vegetables, and then again give half of it to the seniors, and the other part they could take away. So I think it's a social enterprise, and I can't remember quite the name, but pardon?
Lady Flower Garden?
No, the Lady Flower Gardens did the 5-acre growing, and they harvested with the community, and half went to the food bank and the other half went to whoever harvested. So that's what they did. But there's a social enterprise in Edmonton, I know, goes and helps seniors you know, use their food space.
I know that there's a few organizations too, and I'm almost wary about how much to say, but I know that especially within the inner city here in Edmonton, there are some businesses that absolutely, you know, when it's end of day, they will send some of their stuff, bakeries and those types of things. And I feel like it's more that they're networked together with some of the social agencies. So I really am not familiar with what the legislation is around it. But I know that some of the organizations that I've been involved in, we absolutely receive food from, you know, when there's been an event and the food is all still packaged, and it's same day. So again, it has to be kind of that really close networking situation. And because we do have a lot of social agencies and a lot of food, you know, food vendors in the inner city, we do have a pretty good network. But I think that probably there could be better legislation around that. And I think the kind of what goes for now is just as long as it's fully packaged and it's not been opened, then they're able to send it around. And we do see that happening quite a bit, which is really nice to see. And I think it also creates that sense of community too, which is nice.
Yeah, there is one of the bakery called Cops.
Okay.
The Cops every day they send they have a time limit, right? And after that, they have like affiliation with some of the organizations, and they send out their food. They don't sell anything, they send out their.
Yeah.
So which is very good, like they don't waste any foods, right? Like,
So
and the good bad part, I think, like there's one thing, like we're talking about the food, right? So food systems, we talk about the climate things, right? So one of the things, because of the food systems, or like it also sometimes superiority and inferiority complex things with the food system like related, right? If you go to the super store, they have like a corner and they put the sale like there's a almost like you turn yeah, so that like almost take like like not in a stage to eat, right? And they put in that they're still selling that food, right? We have seen that, right?
yeah.
And people are buying, right? So the same human beings, right, were there, and then somebody cannot afford and buying that foods, and the same people like just all human beings, and other buying like bunny like that very good food, right? So this is kind of like the comparison, like you can compare with the food, right? There's also food system, right? We're talking about like, and the people who can afford buy the good food, like the same vegetables, right? And then the tomatoes, especially the tomatoes, right? They are selling like with like 25 cents, right? In the whole package. People buying, and that tomato is not in a state of eating regular coconut. It's almost garbage, right? And they're selling it, right? So this system that is also, I'm like it is kind of like giving the people like when you look at if I'm going to buy that food, if somebody know me, or like this guy buying that food, right? Look at that, their status, right? This type of like a status things also, right? So I don't know, there should be the legislation around, like any regulations around in city or not, suppose not to sell those kind of foods in the store, right? Yeah, so that has to be stopped, right? Something we have to think about, like when you're raising our like boys, right? Something we have to think about that. Like I saw like Superstore has that things. I didn't see other stores selling that, but Superstore does that. So that is not a good practice, right?
And if I'm understanding you correctly, the thing that you're worried about is that it's stigmatizing or because of food safety, like where are you seeing the challenge in that?
Oh, that is actually a very good question, right? Yeah. So one thing we're checking like waste, right? So like what the Cops is doing, Cops Bakery, they don't want the food go waste, right?
Yeah.
They're giving that's very fresh food, right? So that if you cannot sell, that is going directly to that is edible, right? That food is edible, right? Cow's food, I buy from there. I can eat that food for 2 days. I can keep it in my fridge and eat for 2 days, right?
Yeah.
So that their food, they give like they don't waste food, like whatever they can sell on that day, they sell it. If they cannot sell, they give it to the organizations, the people can have it, right? Fresh food, right? But what Superstore doing, like that food, if they can't sell it, they're still selling it. Some food has like even the fungi, right? So like the right develop already there, right? And they're still selling. And people have a lower income, cannot afford it, and they're buying it and eating it. So you can see the there's no any the difference in the people's right lifestyle status, and then even like sometimes if I don't have money, right? If I have to if I go buy and then my friends see like, oh, this guy is buying those kind of foods. Look at that, right? Maybe tomorrow he doesn't want to come to my home and don't want to talk to me, right? So there are discriminations. I would say discriminations in the society, in the people levels, right? Yeah, that's kind of. And this is about regulations. The city doesn't have a regulations to sell those kind of foods, right? Should not be allowed, right? In the selling that, yeah. Or maybe if they cannot sell it, maybe why not Superstore is giving to the organization that can fit other people's, right? Why not they do that, right? Yeah.
And I think that dignity piece is really important, and it's certainly not always something food banks are all that good at. There's some really innovative solutions that a model called the shopping model, where basically, a huge challenge in the system is when the sort of excess of a food system gets dumped on you, and so you end up with 32 pallets of lettuce that is expired tomorrow. And there's just no human way you can get rid of 32 pallets of lettuce in less than in your opening time. And so there's these sort of panic moments in the system where like the organization we didn't have the capacity to deal with it. We didn't have the time to ship it to someone else. And so I think there are models where you can prepare it and then instead of having the here is a basket of food that some volunteer or has chosen what you eat, it's saying, okay, we have these frozen meals, we have this produce, everything's free. You come and shop what you need and have that choice. And I think what you said that really resonated with me is that people deserve that dignity of choice, that like if you can't afford the like non-rotten food in the grocery store, having to go to the 30% off to buy already decaying food is not a dignified way to live in the food system. I don't know if either of you want to respond to that quickly before I go on a quick.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this actually, because I think it's really nuanced. Like so I can remember, like, also my mom buys the 30% off stuff all the time, except not the rotten fruit. And she always says the same thing. And she's like, why are they trying to sell rotten? Like, why do they think somebody's gonna buy this rotten fruit? But if there's like day old bread, we're all over that because it's healthy. It's not as fresh, but it's cheaper. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But absolutely, I agree with you that when you see that they're trying to sell you something that's rotten, that there's something really, that really gets you at that point. And I think that it also affects that kind of image of what that food is. So if there's a 30% off sticker on yogurt, for example, I'm buying it because it's yogurt, right? But then the fact that it's sitting beside some rotten fruit does make me feel ashamed to go and pick up the yogurt. And I think there's an issue with that. And I often think about, like, I remember being a kid and buying secondhand clothing was like, oh my God, don't tell your friends it's secondhand and don't be seen in the secondhand store. And over time, like, perceptions have really changed. And now people are like, no, it's environmentally friendly, it's kind of vintage, it's cool, you can do it. Nobody really feels that. I shouldn't say nobody, I mean, it's still kind of an issue, but there's less of a stigma around it. And I think that there's a happy medium there to be reached around food and what it means to, avoid food waste and I think it comes back to something that you said too around how we can learn from people who are accessing food that is lower cost, for example, and when that's okay and when it's not okay, and when it's creating kind of a situation where you are losing your dignity, or when it's just an intelligent thing to do based on your balanced budget. I remember also being a kid, and in the rural areas, sometimes the farmers would be able to access food for pigs. And a lot of that food was really, really good food. And it would go around the community and it'd be like, we have a ton of chocolate milk. And as kids, we were like, yes, like vats of, chocolate milk. And we would just freeze it and then we would eat it as ice cream. And so it's such a nuanced thing because we should all probably be responsible for making sure that food waste is not happening and not just people who can't afford to buy really fresh food. But there's also that space where, some of it makes sense and some of it is like, who's gonna buy this rotten fruit? You're absolutely right. Yeah. It's a really interesting topic, that one.
Jeanette, I don't know, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think you've all mentioned some really, really great points. The food rescue store in Brandon has a really interesting model where they divert food and they put it into like a retail store that's run primarily by volunteers, but they have stuff that they sell at a reduced cost, which they find reduces stigma, and it's a store that's open to everyone. You don't have to prove income level, you don't have to they're open to everyone, and they have lines outside the door every time they open, and they're just able to get they also use the space as a place to highlight different local products sometimes too. So it's not all just like diverted food that's sold at a reduced cost, but it's a place for the community to kind of get to know different local products as well. I'm not quite sure how do they do that part exactly, but they really do try and focus on the reduced stigma, The idea that people do want to pay for their food when they can. It brings about a sense of dignity to be able to participate in the economy in that way, as opposed to just getting it for free, and being able to select the things that you want and have that kind of retail shopping experience. Yeah, so I think that's all really important stuff to think about. And I think I was going to say something else too, but I can't remember right now. But yeah, I just wanted to give that one example of something that's happening here in Manitoba.
Thanks so much for such an amazing discussion. There's been some really nice comments as well in the chat. So someone mentioned chain or like an organization that does this sort of work called Peco Produce that sells like peculiar and surplus produce in Western Canada, which is kind of cool. There's been a lot of appreciation in the chat for bringing up this conversation about low wages as a barrier to accessing this like a more sustainable food system. Adrian just put in the chat, the Loop is another organization that does food triage and rescue. The Loop is interesting. I see their drinks in the fancy drink aisle though. So sometimes I'm like, oh, I kind of want to buy this because I know it's like, you know, doing good work, but it's also like $6. So I'm like, I don't know. So again, like, you know, it's bringing up this whole issue of cost again as barriers, but just conscious of time. And of course, you folks in Edmonton, feel free to continue this conversation as long as you guys want to. But I think for the rest of us, just mindful that I want to respect people's evenings and also be able to properly thank everyone for their time and participation and our amazing panelists. I've learned so much in this conversation. I'm sure I speak for everyone. It's been really great to just listen honestly and have these thoughts swimming around in my brain. I'm sure I'll be thinking about them all soon. Lena puts a good point as well in the chat that in the future, in the fall, we will be having a creative writing workshop focused on food. So if you're interested in expressing your ideas on climate change and food systems and whatnot in the form of art, in the form of writing, feel free to ask Lena a little bit more about that. I'm sure if you are signed up to our newsletters as well, notice of that will be going out. So I think, you know, food is on the mind. I think, as mentioned before, it is, you know, a very tangible way that people connect to the climate crisis, connect to the space that surrounds us. And so it's very, very pertinent this year. I want to also just pass it on to Steve here, who's our regional organizer in Alberta, who's got a quick little shout out as well. Oh, you're unmuted.
I'll never learn to unmute. That's beyond me. So yeah, so actually I just wanted to put a link into our latest podcast episode. I asked the biggest questions I could possibly ask of some really smart people, specifically about the value of carbon capture and storage, the Pathways Alliance, Alberta's net zero by 2050 talk that they're giving. When I wrote the editorial, I actually said out loud that this is heresy. You are being a heretic in Alberta by even mentioning this. So anyways, I want to share that with you, and I hope you give it a listen. I hope you give me some feedback. I put a little note in the chat there, but that's where you can get access to it. Beyond that, a great presentation tonight, and it's always nice to listen to smart people who care about the right things.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, and I actually don't know if your chat went through. I can't see it.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I'll send up a follow-up email with resources that were shared in the chat so that you all don't have to scramble right now to write it all down. And I will also send a reminder about registering for our next Prairies community call, which will be happening, I believe, sometime in October. And again, trying to be thematically like seasonal. We will be talking about buildings and keeping your houses warm while also understanding that buildings are one of the largest causes of emissions in the prairies specifically, but also in Canada, because we are a cold country and we want to stay warm. But how do we do that in a way that respects the transition? And so that's a conversation to come. If you're interested in learning about that, join us in
And
October.
increasingly we have to stay cool too. Becoming
Indeed.
a bigger all the time too. So
Exactly. We really are getting it from both sides. It's intense. But well, have a wonderful night. It's time now, but I wish everyone in Edmonton a wonderful night. It's really great to see you. It's been really wonderful to have everyone here, and have a wonderful night, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
See you all.
Bye.
But